The Shadow in the Appalachians. Deep in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains lies a place the locals call the Valley of Silence. No marked trail leads there, and animals instinctively avoid its boundaries. For generations, stories of strange disappearances have circulated, but more than anything, people have learned to keep their distance. That warning, however, never reached Sophie and Jack. Sophie, a passionate photographer of remote landscapes, and Jack, her adventurous boyfriend, decided to venture into the Appalachians in search of breathtaking photos and an unforgettable experience. They had heard vague rumors about the Valley of Silence but dismissed them as mere superstition. To them, the isolation only added a layer of mystery. The first day of their hike was incredible. The mountains, shrouded in morning mist, seemed to whisper ancient secrets. Each step took them further away from civilization, and with each passing twilight, the shadows among the trees grew longer and stranger. Sophie constantly stopped to take photos, captivated by the untamed beauty. Jack, on the other hand, began to feel something else, a growing unease as if the trees were murmuring warnings he couldn't fully comprehend. On the second day, the forest began to change. The trees, once majestic and vibrant, now appeared twisted, as if stricken by some disease. The birds stopped singing. The wind, once playful among the leaves, now carried an unnatural chill. By late afternoon, they reached what they believed was the edge of the infamous Valley of Silence. There was absolutely nothing, no sound, no movement, no life. The valley floor was covered in a thick fog that didn't seem to move, not even with the breeze. Against Jack's instincts, they decided to camp nearby, waiting for the perfect light for photos the next day. That night, Sophie woke up startled. Outside the tent, she heard what she thought were soft footsteps, like someone slowly circling the camp. She peeked through the zipper but saw nothing. Jack, still asleep, hadn't heard anything, so she decided not to wake him and went back to sleep. But just as she was drifting off, the footsteps returned, closer this time, too close. Sophie shook Jack awake, and he sat up in alarm. They both scrambled out of the tent with their flashlights but found nothing. No signs of animals, no wind, not even footprints. The silence was so deep, it felt suffocating. They decided to stay awake for the rest of the night, sitting by the fire. But as the hours passed, exhaustion overcame them, and their eyes slowly closed. At dawn, Sophie woke up alone. Jack was gone. She stood up, calling his name, but there was no response. His backpack was still there, so he couldn't have gone far. Thinking he might have gone exploring, she decided to wait. However, time passed and Jack did not return. Desperate, Sophie decided to follow the trail of footprints she found at the edge of the camp, leading toward the valley. The tracks led her into the heart of the fog. As she ventured deeper, Sophie felt the temperature plummet. Her breath became visible in the air, and her footsteps echoed strangely around her. Then she saw it, far in the distance, through the mist, the blurry figure of Jack moving between the trees. "Jack!" Sophie shouted. But he didn't respond. She began to run toward him. But the closer she got, the further away he seemed to be. The fog thickened. Now Sophie couldn't see anything but warped shadows surrounding her, and then she heard the laughter. A dry, distorted sound that echoed from all directions. She spun around, but there was no one. Panicking, she tried to run back, but the fog was a labyrinth closing in on her. Suddenly a hand as cold as ice touched her shoulder. Sophie turned quickly, only to find Jack's face inches from hers. But something was wrong. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were completely black. "Sophie," he whispered in a strange voice. "You shouldn't have come." His mouth twisted into a terrifying grin as something moved in the shadows behind him. Sophie screamed and started running blindly. With the oppressive fog swirling around her, she knew she wasn't running toward the exit, but deeper into the valley. The laughter grew louder, as if the earth itself was mocking her desperation. Finally, exhausted, she collapsed to the ground. The fog cleared just enough for Sophie to see what surrounded her. She was in the center of a circle of twisted trees, and among them were bodies. Hundreds of withered bodies, as if they had been there for centuries. Their faces, twisted in eternal agony, seemed to be watching her. Sophie felt a presence behind her. She slowly turned, and there was Jack. But not as before. His body had become a grotesque shadow, deformed, almost blending into the mist itself. "Come with us," he whispered, and before she could scream, a shadow fell over her, engulfing her in eternal cold. Days later, a group of hikers found Sophie and Jack's campsite. Everything was intact, except for them. There were no signs of struggle, no indications that anything strange had happened. Only Sophie's camera remained, lying on the ground, with one last photo taken. The image showed the Valley of Silence, blanketed in mist, and among the shadows, a figure. It seemed to be Jack, smiling. But behind him, emerging from the mist, a dark silhouette loomed, watching. When the locals heard about it, they simply shook their heads. They knew no one should enter that valley. No one ever leaves once they've been claimed by the shadows.